Well, hello, welcome to Round the Table Live with Christian Concern. And today we are talking about National Conservatism. There was a big conference in London this week, which I attended, and various others. And I'm delighted to welcome two special guests today, Aaron Edwards and Tony Rucinski, to join us. Aaron is a theologian, Dr. Aaron Edwards. He was, you may remember, a lecturer at Cliff College and lost his job very, very suddenly and quickly after a controversial tweet which expressed orthodox views on sexual morality. Aaron, great, thank you for joining us. And we also have Tony Rucinski, who is a director of the Coalition for Marriage, with us as well today. Great to see you as well, Tony. And Andrea Williams, our chief executive, is also joining the conversation.
Tim, I'm sorry, but how can you say Aaron's tweet was controversial?
Well, obviously, some people thought it was controversial. He wouldn't have lost his job if it had no controversy, Andrea. So, you've got to say that's reasonable to say that.
I think he was standing for marriage between one man and one woman. And the era that was entering the church. So I kind of know what you mean, but it's quite something when that becomes an issue of controversy.
No one should lose their job for a tweet like that. No one should
lose their job.
Especially not in a Christian college, in a Christian theology. Anyway, we've been over this before, but that's not the topic today, but it is a shocking situation that happened. But listen, we went to this conference, Aaron, Tony and I, and it's important to say it wasn't a party political conference. There was a lot of criticism of the Conservative Party at the conference. There were people there who said I've never voted Conservative as well. But nevertheless, it was a very interesting conference with some great speakers there. Aaron, why don't I ask you first, and I'll come to Tony. Why did you attend this conference? What were you seeking to get out of it?
Yeah, thanks. I think I was invited. Someone gave me a kind of free ticket to come and said, we'll pay for you to come down and it'll be good for you to be involved in it. And that was, so I looked into it, I looked at the speaker schedule and I thought, wow, this is really interesting because you had a mixture of, a few Conservative MPs, including some front benchers speaking, but it clearly wasn't a Tory party conference. But then loads of people who are very interesting in relation to the relationship between church and culture, which is something I'm particularly interested in. And so thinking that seeing people like Rod Dreher on there and people who've written into these issues like Sebastian Milbank and Lois McClatchy and others, it's really interesting just to see, wow, they're clearly taking God kind of seriously. And they seem to be thinking that this is the key to the future of conservative values per se, which is something that conservatives tend to just say, but it felt like they really meant it this time. So I thought that's just a really interesting thing to consider. So for me, that was the primary reason. And of course, a lot of very good, wise thinking, even from people who aren't Christians or even necessarily pro-Christian. I just thought there's some wise looking people there, and it's always worth listening to them.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Tony, why did you attend the conference?
Well, Tim, that's a really good question. So I, like many of the over 800 other people that were there, over half of which, by the way, were under the age of 30, unlike me, despite my looks. But don't laugh. But so I attended because, like many of those people, and if indeed like thousands of people I speak to up and down the country, they feel they're politically homeless because it used to be the case that both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party supported traditional family values. And what they would argue about is how you use the economy to support those family values. But that's gone. Now both of them are pretty much neck and neck aligned with each other on the economy and what they want to do. And there's hardly anything between them. And they've both forgotten about traditional family values. So for me, it was a great opportunity to go and meet with people, fellow people who believe the same thing, that actually we need to do something to restore faith in the family in our country, because it really is the bedrock of society.
Brilliant. Well, and we'll come straight on to family next. But if you've got particular questions for any of our guests today or about the conference, do put them in the chat if you're watching live on YouTube or Facebook, and we can see that and we will try and get to them. But I attended the conference because I thought, similar to Aaron, really, a lot of really interesting speakers. Yoram Hazony, whose books I've read, I think I've reviewed The Virtues of Nationalism on Christian Conservative website somewhere. And his more recent book, Conservatism Rediscovered, is also a very, very good book. But yes, family values featured a lot, didn't they, Tony, at the conference? And in particular, I think day one, Miriam Cates, MP, gave an excellent speech where she said we have a crisis in fertility. The fertility rate in the UK is only 1.55 births per woman. It needs to be 2.1 to be replacement rate, well below the replacement rate. And this will cause a collapse in society, and immigration is not a fix for this. And she suggested a number of causes, such as family breakdown. The UK is the highest in the OECD. And of course, he made that worse recently with no-fault divorce. Other causes included housing policy, not very easy to find a house to raise children in, residential university, taking people away from the family, and lack of tax support for families as well. What was your analysis of that, Tony? What did you think? Did you agree with her?
She raised a lot of the important points. I mean, we've redefined marriage twice in this country. Once to say it includes same-sex people, so basically excluding the essential nature of women from marriage. And secondly, as Miriam mentioned, the idea of no-fault divorce. So that excludes the nature of permanence from marriage. And basically what we've done in all those things is we've said marriage is about who likes who. Now, that's absolutely ridiculous, because what has a government got to do with who likes who? The only reason a government should get involved with individual personal relationships is when kids are concerned. And so the idea is you do what you can to promote the raising of the best version of the next generation. And that, all the evidence suggests, is growing up with your married mum and dad. Now, we recognise, of course, there are situations where that doesn't happen: adultery, abuse, abandonment. But generally speaking, looking on a population basis, everyone knows, it's abundantly clear, that you get the best start in life if you grow up with your biological mum and dad in a married relationship. And everyone knows that. But as soon as the government changes things, well, the trouble is that trickles through into society. We have a situation where we've got now where the people who are giving these messages, the better well-off in society, the elites, some might call them, they're marrying in big numbers and staying married. But the people who are really suffering are the people right down the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, the people who could really do with the benefits of marriage and stable families. And they're just listening to the rhetoric and thinking, well, it's all meaningless. Why would I bother? And I think it's terrible. And a lot of people realise that. A lot of people want to do something about it. And I think that's what made a lot of people come to the conference.
Brilliant. Yeah. Aaron, what were your thoughts on this whole fertility and family breakdown issue?
I was so glad to hear that spoken about, because even in conservative, philosophical and or political conservative circles, that's still not somewhere you've seen people really go to town. I know articles have been coming out about it, but they've been very ambivalent. My own podcast with Andy Bannister, Part of the Gaps, we did an episode on should we be having more kids, and felt like we were pushing the boat out and got a bit of flack for some of that. I forget how many months ago that was, but it's just really obvious. Like, the good thing about
you've got 5 children, you're doing your part there.
I'm doing my bit. So previously there have been people critiquing me. My wife, when we had 3 children, she went to the GP. And the GP said to her, just in a private conversation about something else, I think she was getting medicine for one of them, do we need to talk about contraception?
Oh my goodness!
Oh wow!
At 3 kids, it was like, do you understand how this works? Like, I know you've got 3 children. Do you understand what
Aaron,
happens?
I'm going to encourage you to have some more.
Yeah,
I've got 4. But, I kind of now wish I had 10. And
do you want some of mine?
It's great.
No, that's a complete joke. If they're listening, I'm completely joking there. I love you very much.
Yeah, you're going to be subtweeted to death for that now. You're going to be demonized. Horrible bad. But so I think it's genuinely like having, funnily enough, for Christians, actually having a socially inappropriate amount of children is quite a good witness. And we genuinely do have people who, my wife would have conversations with them when we now homeschool, but when they were in school, she'd be in conversations with mothers who have 1 child from IVF, probably in their 40s. And they have the two incomes, and they've got the 2 cars, they've got the nice skiing holidays, but nothing replaces the blessing of children. And the mothers know that, but they feel like they have to follow the narrative of culture, which says, oh no, get yourself sorted first, and then later on you can think about settling down. So we're marrying later, having children later, it's costing the earth, and they can't have as many as they would like. And then they look at Molly, my wife, walking along with 5 children, and being like, wow, how do you do that? You must be a super mum. I couldn't possibly do that. And I think, well, that's what most mums did for most of civilization. This isn't 5 children isn't a crazy amount of children. It's quite a normal amount. Yeah. In terms of historically speaking.
I know I said 10, but my father was the youngest of 10. I'm really proud. My grandparents had 10 children, and my mother was the youngest of 7. So and my father's Italian, my mother's English. But the idea, and my grandparents Well, my grandfather was an itinerant farm labourer.
So, but Anthea, why do you think people are having less children now? What do you think can be done about it?
Sorry, was that a question to me, Tim? Or
yes.
Well, I think that socially, I mean, it's the culture that is the culture that has changed, and the acceptance of large. There is no longer a norm. The contraceptive pill in the 1960s began to put pay to people having multiple children, having children naturally. I mean, what would have happened with my grandparents' generation is that was the amount of children that literally that God gave them.
Yep.
This was pre the contraception era. So,
yeah. So there's a guy called Mark Regnerus who writes about this quite well, and he says how marriage and children has gone from the cornerstone of your life, what you build your life upon, to the capstone, what you kind of do at the end of your life, you know, to crown your achievements. And, you know, he says that you just miss the point, you miss the joy, you miss the wonder of, I mean, I grew up a single parent family, and it wasn't good. You know, I'm not going to go on about it, but it really wasn't good. And I compare that now with a happy home, loving parents, 4 kids, and there's just nothing like it in terms of the good start that it gives them in life. There's absolutely nothing like it. And the other thing, which on that theme, which was raised at the conference, was my wife found when we had our kids, she wanted to stay at home and raise them, if you like, until they went to school. And that was, you know, even her friends some of them would think, that's a bit weird. Why aren't you putting them in daycare and going out to work? And that's another big change we've had in society. And it is a lot to do with house prices and all that sort of stuff. But actually, there's this spectre of, what's wrong with you? You're second-class citizen if you're at home looking after your kids. And that's something we need to change because, you know, I think women they've got the best role out of all humanity, you know, in terms of raising the best version of the next generation and influencing them and teaching them how to, you know, the difference between wrong and right and all those sorts of things. It's amazing what a woman gets to do with her child. And not only that, the funny thing is, you know, when you look at things like, you know, all the theoretical stuff about, you know, the means of production and private ownership and all that sort of stuff, a mother and her baby are the ultimate example of possession. You know, the ultimate example of belonging and the ultimate example of the means of production. And I think as a society, that's something we need to really, really protect and honour much more than we do.
Well, can I just jump in on that quickly, Tim?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Or just one other thing in relation to that, which I think perhaps wasn't covered at the conference. So I was delighted to hear how much they were speaking about this issue, as I said, and it kept coming up in all of the presentations, especially on the first day, but then it continued. But there wasn't as much of a push towards the significance of fatherhood and masculinity in relation to that. So of course there was helpfully equipped. There's people like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington who were kind of reactionary feminists, as they'd call themselves. Yeah. It's good to see women critiquing feminism, saying feminism has been bad for women in loads of ways. And I think there is a knock-on effect for masculinity and for fatherhood. So boys not growing up with the kind of responsibility and then wanting to take that responsibility, having that desire for a legacy and a desire to procreate and a desire to be responsible and look after and be a man of one woman, as it were. Yeah. And I think that has a huge effect.
Yep.
I think I was struck recently because I heard one of these people say that, of course, in not many generations ago, having children was an investment, and you would expect them to. You'd get workers for your family business or your labourers in your farm, and you'd get people who would care for you later in life as well. And it was kind of a financial investment in a way. And now having children is viewed as a financial liability, and people weigh up the cost. You know, it's going to cost me a lot of money to have a child and cope with all of that. And this sort of ties in what Jacob Rees-Mogg said. What struck me was he said the state will pay anyone to take care of your children except for the parents. You'll be penalised if you take care of your children.
This is where I like places like this is where we've actually seen some countries modelling different policies. So in Hungary, and I was privileged to go and visit Hungary and meet with some of the ministers there, and to see how actually incentivising homes, incentivising marriage. First of all, encouraging people to get married. I think that the statistic is, I don't want to misquote it, and perhaps someone here will be able to, perhaps someone can find it, but it's something extraordinary in how in the past decade, how marriage has risen. It's something like by 10% or possibly more. but also then the government is encouraging mums to stay at home by giving tax breaks for a number of years at the beginning. If they have over 3 children, or when they need to get a bigger car, actually incentivizing the family again in terms of buying a car, all of these things. And we're seeing that marriages are staying together. Children are being raised with a mum and dad at home in a marriage situation. And of course, that means that there's a healthier and a happier society, because policy, centre of government, is impacting that. Whereas here, there is very little that's incentivizing marriage. Fewer and fewer people are getting married. So even where parents are together, they're quite often not. They quite often unmarried, and there's nothing particularly as a result of that to encourage people to stay together, to really work through the hard times.
Yep, that's right. And it's worth making that point, Andrew, because, you know, marriage actually isn't easy, and it is something that needs working at. And when you you redefine it to mean, it's about who likes who, you completely remove the nature of the fact that marriage is a covenantal commitment with you and society. And it isn't just based on whether or not you like the other person on any particular day. It's much more important than that. And picking up on absolutely. Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. And I want to make it clear to any Coalition for Marriage viewers that are watching us today, you know, Coalition for Marriage have people from all faiths and none. So I'll say a lot, which is Coalition for Marriage policy, but as a Christian, I may well go beyond that. And you're absolutely right. There's a whole spiritual side to this. But one of the speakers was Theodore Dalrymple. And he's written a book, Life at the Bottom, his experience as a prison psychologist. And he talks about this massive undercurrent of people, and mainly men, lost men who grew up in fatherless homes, who then end up in the criminal justice system and have no hope. And just you're right, Aaron, the value of fathers, the absolute essential value of fathers, and all this talk about toxic masculinity. Yes, masculinity can be toxic, but masculinity itself is valuable. Everything around you was built through masculinity. You know, the country has been defended through masculinity. It's not a bad thing, and it's really, really good for children to have dads around.
Oh, sorry, Tim, I keep jumping. Just one tiny footnote on that. I love that point, Tony. It reminds me of a book by Anthony Easterlin, who's a Catholic writer. He wrote a book called No Apologies, Why Civilization Depends Upon the Strength of Men. And he tells a story about even just the kind of feats that were required to create Western civilization that women could not possibly have done. And he isn't saying women are terrible. He's saying women complement men in amazing ways.
Absolutely right.
He said, he often says, when feminists say, I want to have more opportunity in the workplace, I wonder if they even ask how water got to their city. Men had to dig tunnels for like days and days, and they were doing that in horrible conditions in order to provide for their family. That's why they went through hell.
And many of them worked until they dropped dead. And many people today many men work until they drop dead to put food on the table for their families, to build infrastructure and do all sorts of things around us. But you've got to remember, just like, you know, in Genesis, when God was creating stuff, he created stuff more important later on. And what was the last thing he created? After man, it was woman. You know, and that is really saying something. It's not a question of who's better than the other. We've just got different kind of aptitudes and different kind of abilities. But actually, God created woman last as the peak of his creation. Let's never forget that.
This is really anecdotal, but you know, I spent the first 7 or 8 years of my working life as a criminal family barrister. But I used to always say at the courtroom when I was in the dealing with those that were in the criminal system, that when the mother had abandoned, when the mother wasn't there, you really knew that we were in absolute dire straits, because very often the last person that was with the people that I was very often defending was the mother. And so, you know, very often there had not been on the scene, as we've said here, you know, but the mother was often there, really still loving her son. But when that's gone as well, you know, and this is the thing of a spiraling society. And I think, as you mentioned earlier as well, Tony, I think one of the hard things is to watch. It's not so much the privileged elites, but rather those that are stuck in generational cycles of abandonment. And we want to bring hope to them, because, of course, you know, We want to bring hope to those that are raising children in single parent situations. We want to bring hope into those families and to model family and to bring them into families. And of course, that's where the church has a real role to play in terms of really loving and modeling and living in community with one another, and seeing the transforming love of Christ that can come into these families. We need to be speaking these into policies at heart of government, because I believe that if we make these policies, we will see a difference in the whole of society. And of course, on the ground, in our communities, we need to be countercultural, as Aaron has said, to be having lots of children, but with those children and with those families, welcoming all those around us, welcome them into our homes, welcome them into our churches, and building real community and real love amongst people that we live amongst. Because there's a lot of hope that we can give from the love of Christ and modeling family.
Absolutely right. Modeling we were walking down the street not too long ago, holding hands with my wife, and somebody came up and said, "Isn't it lovely to see that?" And you think, well, why? It's just a lovely thing to do. Why would you not want to do that? It's a great thing to do. But, our whole economic system, so the idea of the benefit system, if you're down the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum and you get benefits, if you move in with the father of your children, you lose benefits. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. If you're paying tax and your husband or wife is paying tax, well, you don't get to transfer your allowances. So if the mum stays at home, well, she doesn't benefit from that at all. The government do not incentivise or recognise anything like that. And we just need to, I think that's what the passion of the conference was about. Hold on, we've forgotten the stuff that's really important, and we're talking about the fluff all the time.
Very good. Well, Aaron, presumably you liked hearing Danny Kruger MP saying the normative family, the mother and father sticking together for the sake of children, is the only basis for a safe and functioning society. It's not only about you, it's a public act to live for the sake of someone else. Aaron, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think just demonstrating, like Andrea was saying there, the importance of the hope that you can offer, and that does come from that sense of sacrifice. Again, linking to Tony's thing, it isn't just about who likes who. It's not just that there's a certain feelings. It's that word covenant, which our generation has absolutely no idea how to interpret what covenant means. It's entirely based on, what's Carl Trueman's term, expressive individualism. I want to express my individual passions and emotions, and this is how. So love is great. We love love because we think of it as romantic feelings of love. We don't think of it in terms of covenant, and then we have a way of. This is something my wife she's home educating our children, and she's teaching them about the Victorians at the moment. We're all learning a lot about the Victorians by actually studying them. We have this image in our head that we pivot off the Victorian era. We go, look at these terribly prudish Victorians with their big families and the terribly oppressed women, and they're all really unhappy. And Molly's reading these journals of housewives who are incredibly happy and well fulfilled. And then you read books like Melanie Phillips's book about the history of the suffragettes, who says a lot of the early suffragette movements were spinsters and lesbians who didn't have a happy marriage. It's not because they felt happily married, and they're winning these kind of married women who are like, oh, actually, maybe I ought to have more of a kind of say in these ways. So I'm certainly not critiquing all of feminism. I just think a lot of what we do today is we think, how do we make sense of our society, the choices of the post-sexual revolution that we have to keep saying are great. We've got to keep saying the sexual revolution was brilliant and liberating, because we have a bogeyman, which is the Victorians. Women were suppressed, don't educate them, they're terrible. Do you want to go back to that horrible time? Let me show you a photograph of a very unhappy looking Victorian family, looking very prim and proper and repressed. So things like that. And in fact, someone told me recently that one of the reasons Victorian family photos always look like that is because apparently they had to sit still with the same expression for 2 minutes because of the technology of the camera or something. So that's kind of a weird way that we interpret another era as a pivot. So we go, this is how we make sense of all of the craziness in our era. Well, would you prefer this? And actually often that is a caricature. And so one of the Victorian values was self-sacrifice, and it was to say you're putting your family and often your country, before. So patriotism and family are connected as well. So for some, they might find that uncomfortable. So I like the family stuff, but the idea of liking your country, that's a bit weird and probably Nazi-like, isn't it? No, that's not. That's quite a normal thing for people to say. The people of my country, I want to be for my nation because that's connected to me being for my family. I want to be, making a difference, raising children then who are in families who are going to make a difference. So the other thing to say on that is quickly, the nonsense about, having children is bad for the environment. I mean, can you believe what kind of idiotic world we live in, where like well-educated journalists and politicians can think this and say it publicly? I think it's astonishing. Having children is bad for human civilization at a time when birth rates are plummeting, and then trying to have all these caveats to stop you saying the kind of things that Kruger was saying, which is, look, this is just the norm is good. And it doesn't mean that there's going to be a load of people who don't fit that norm. I get that. There'll be people in broken homes who they go, what does that mean? I don't count. No, we're not saying that. We're just saying the norms are norms, and they're supposed to underpin and.
Although when Matt Hancock says, you shouldn't be saying this stuff, it's offensive. Well, what's his track record in marriage?
Yeah. And this is another problem we've got, right? Because we've separated personality from public life, So it used to be that you're one person. What you do in private is who you are in public. And actually, there is no difference, And if you can't, if the nearest and dearest that you have in your life can't trust you, why on earth should we get out of public life? And I think one of the things we need to do is restore that connection. If you're a flawed character privately, we do not want you publicly. And we need to restore that connection and say, we want, people who we know we can trust because they're trustworthy with their nearest and dearest. And that's fundamental. The idea that Matt Hancock can somehow say, I'm adulterer, suck it up, just move on. No, it means we can't trust you, I'm afraid. And that's the end of it.
I mean, you move on. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, flagrant adultery and being proud and thinking that there isn't a whole lot of character issues attached to that, as if it really doesn't matter, is very serious indeed. Of course, again, what the gospel can do in all situations is bring forgiveness and redemption.
Yep.
This is the same. Very often when I look at situations where there is family breakdown or breakdown between parents, and even there, the good news of the gospel can restore and heal in these places. Again, this wonderful message that is the gospel, Jesus, the transformer of individuals, but of lives, that his fragrance can be known in these situations of seeming brokenness. And forgiveness can be found, and restoration and redemption, because Jesus can heal in situations that we can't even imagine. And I think that's that we need to continually bring out and be speaking into. And that's why it's important that our witness on the ground is important indeed.
And go on, Tony.
This is such an important part, Andrew. You're absolutely right. Such an important part of marriage too. Marriage involves forgiveness. Actually, we all make mistakes, and I'm not the person I would have been had I not met my wife. She has reformed me by the grace of God. And similarly, she's not the person. But that involves, the biblical analogy of iron sharpening iron is an abrasive analogy. That's quite tough. And it's a tough process. But actually, it's useful to make you sharper and make you better. But, Matt Hancock, there's no repentance there. There's no desire to, or regret for what he's done. He's almost proud of it. Yeah. And you think, and that's the trouble with so much of our, political and public life, that people almost think, well, I'm going to behave like that and I'm proud of it and it's okay. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah,
well, so go on. I was just going to say, it links into the loss of biblical foundations for marriage. Obviously, the reason why we think marriage is a good idea, even now, because I think marriage is on the way to, I think eventually people will abolish marriage, or the way that we're going, marriage will be like, what? Why would we bother doing that weird religious thing? So gay marriage, I think I've said publicly a few times, those who are wanting to extend what marriage is really ought to be thought of as marriage abolitionists.
They're
actually trying. They're wanting to change what it is, and they're saying, let's just keep marriage. We'll just add more people into it. What you're doing is you're changing what it is. God gets to define what marriage is. God invented people. Invented the idea of people and sex and love. And so he has the bound. The Bible has a lot to say. So that's kind of where you might have a lot to say on this, Tony, I presume. But it was like there's just the stuff on the fact that there's some insight on marriage that can only be gotten from a Christian perspective. Doesn't mean you can't be married and enjoy elements of it.
So it's like, I mean, I get what you're saying. That okay. So firstly, in a liberal democracy, I think within the bounds of the law, adults should be able to live the lives they want to do. That's one thing. Now, biblically, there are other opinions, and biblically, same-sex unions are out quite very, very explicitly and very clearly. But in the context of a secular liberal democracy, I get the fact that other things may take place. But I use the example of salt, right? Salt, sodium, and chlorine joining together. Now, salt has a particular effect. It reduces the rate of decay, it adds flavour, it acts as a fertiliser, all sorts of things like that. If you rename salt to include things that look a bit like salt, let's say sugar or baby powder or heroin, what kind of a mess are you going to be in the kitchen? Can you imagine that? And saying that is not phobic to any other chemical or compound. It just is what it is. Now, marriage is the thing that only a man and a woman can do. And that's not homophobic. It's just a fact that, growing up with your... all of us watching and listening here today come from a man and a woman. End of conversation. And there's nothing you can do to explain or replace that. It is what it is. And it's not phobic to anything at all to say that. And I just think we need to maintain in our society, in our culture, the value of that kind of relationship. And like I said, it doesn't mean...
I'll respond to you a little bit on that, on something you said earlier in this. It was never good for the law to recognise civil partnerships in 2004. This was never a good thing. This was actually giving legal status. It was unnecessary because there are ways in which to, for people that want to live as same-sex couples, if there are certain rights that they want to adhere to, homes and legacies and so on and so forth, there are ways of doing that. The idea of privileging a relationship, which in God's eyes is one that is sinful, and but actually privileging that in law, was the forerunner for marriage, for same-sex marriage, which was a thing that has then been the dismantling of society. What we also did with civil partnerships in and around that time was we wholly redefined family. So we extended it so that same-sex couples could access children by fertility treatments as well. So it's not as simple as that. It's not just saying we're going to live and let live and let law recognise live and let live. Because ultimately what we did was, in effect, we ripped up marriage, the true meaning of marriage, way beyond the Same-Sex Marriage Act of way before the Same-Sex Marriage Act of 2014. And it was really the church not recognising that and speaking into and discipling the institutions to see what we were doing 30 years ago. So
you're right. You made two really good points there.
We do legislate morality. So these things are pretty, I'd say that these things are pretty vital.
Can we just move on though? Because I'm conscious we spent a lot of time on family, and there was a lot of talk at the conference on family and family values and marriage, all of that kind of thing. But there was also history and education and economics and various other subjects as well. But the panel that was particularly interesting to me was the one on God and country, and the role of faith and Christianity in the mix of conservatism and politics. And one of the speakers that struck me was Benedict Keeley, who said there's no place for optimism in any discussion of God and country. If we don't do God, then we don't do country, and then we won't do a future. Aaron, what was your reflections on that statement?
Yeah, it was interesting. I really, that panel was really interesting. I think on his comments, Keeley's comments especially, were really, I liked how, in general, how confident he was in terms of just asserting the Christian worldview, which I think is what we need. We need more confidence in our values and in our faith. And I think that was quite a bold statement from him to say you can't even have a nation. And I presume some secularists would be there going, "Ooh, that's a bit strong." And I'd probably contrast those comments. Firstly, I think he also said you can't be optimism and pessimism are not Christian categories of thought. There's no pessimism or optimism. We have hope. Hope, to go back to what Andrea said, we have actual hope. As we think of Hebrews 11:1, faith being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you don't see. We have something that's beyond just how can we create a good societal structure or a good nation. But there are absolutely links between the kind of meaning structure that you would have for your life in a worldview, a secular worldview. When you give up the public square to secularism and just assume everything's going to work fine, it isn't. and we've seen secularism absolutely ravage nationhood in so many countries where it has been there, unless it's totalitarian and it just kind of forces a kind of love of nation, but it isn't really love of nation. It's do what we say or we'll punish you. We have seen in the West a massive anti-national movement, which is why this movement, National Conservatism, has been so interesting, because it's like people are worried because of the national. They're like, well, that sounds a bit like National Socialism. But like the Nazis didn't invent the idea of caring for your country. That's like everybody. It's a normal human thing to care for your country, like I said earlier. So him making that link was really interesting, and it contrasted.
And we have the National Trust, the National Health Service, the NSPCT.
That's right. I forget who said that. Yeah. They're saying that could all go wrong. Well, let's get rid of the word national from the National Health Service. Who's up for that? That'd be quite fun musically too. But they, I think that it was a contrast to David Starkey, the historian. I think maybe the day before the panel, the day before, and he's just saying, I'm an atheist. So he said lots of really interesting things. Quite a few I agreed with, some I didn't agree with, and he is a very divisive character, but he also has a fair bit of good sense to say. But the thing I didn't agree with, when he said, Christianity for us is like Shinto. It's like, and a few people I spoke to mentioned they were troubled by that phrase as well. Like, it's just a cultural religion that's bound into the fabric of who we are as a nation, and we should be proud of Christianity and what it's done. But I don't believe it. I don't really need to believe it. And I thought that's insane. Like what we built the country on was actual Christianity, of people actually believing the stuff, and that's how we got buildings in Westminster which have scripture all over the walls, like the place where we were. It's because people had confidence in their faith; they actually believed it. So now we've got the thing with NatCon it's like, yes, we love this Christian heritage, but the question I asked the panel after that session was, is there a danger that Christian heritage becomes a kind of idol, because you're really saying, we love this stuff, we don't need to believe it, even though the only reason any of it works is because of actual faith. You're kind of saying, God will take all of that lovely heritage and all those lovely values, we'll just chop off the roots and we'll see what we're left with. So I know liberals do that anyway with tolerance and diversity. They've taken Christian values and just truncated them. Conservatives can do the same. They can say, we love family, we love all these values, we just don't, and we love talking about God, but we don't actually have to have existential buy-in or live our lives, or the demands that Christ would place on us, take up our cross, suffer for him. Let's just use the values and build meaning. I don't think that's going to work. Though I appreciate the conversations are happening. I love it. It's way better than what we've got as an alternative. I just think the Conservatives at that conference needed to be challenged to be like, you can't just do God in the concept. You need to actually live for God.
Right. Look at the Church of England. That proves that quite straight away, doesn't it? Really, the mess that's. But you're absolutely right. It was. I think the first time I came across Tim, you were giving a talk about the fact that actually everyone worships a God. What you get to do is choose who that God is, whether that God is the God of the Bible, or whether that God is secularism, or whether that God is yourself. And depending on who you worship will depend on what your definition of wrong and right is, and what good and bad, and all those sorts of things. And we seem to, as a country, have abandoned the fact that there are objective definitions for those things, which as Christians would say, you often get hassle as a Christian, speaking up as a Christian, and people will try and make fun of you. And you then say to them, well, hold on, what of Jesus's teachings, which ones do you disagree with? What that he says do you think is wrong? Can you tell me? And of course they've got nothing, because there is nothing, because actually his ways are right. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and his ways are right. And that's why when God talks about things, I don't want to go back onto the marriage thing, but when he talks about things like marriage, you can see abundant secular evidence in the real world to support it, because God is good. End of conversation.
Well, I was struck that there was a lot of Christians at the conference, actually. A lot of, there's several Wilberforce, what do you call it? Wilberforce
alumni.
Alumni.
There were.
Wilberforce Academy, that's the word, that's the full academy. And there were several other Christian groups and Christian individuals represented, and there was quite large applause for statements that we need to bring God back into the equation and into the culture and into politics as well. There's also quite a large Jewish contingent as well there. So a lot of believers in God at this conference, and I think that perhaps there's quite a strong link there between proper belief in a kind of objective conservative value.
Well, Tim, you on this kind of podcast, I think you've spoken to Stephen McCoy. who's wrote the excellent book, what is it, In His Image, Introduction to Biblical Introduction to Social Ethics, something like that. Yes. And the point is that, the Bible says that you are the salt of the earth, that we are the people who stop the rate of decay. And that's it. There is no other salt. So if Christians don't get involved, if they don't stand up, if they don't speak up, and don't forget the Great Commission was not just to, Jesus didn't say, just go and tell people that I lived and I died for your sins, and if you believe in me, and repent, you will go to heaven. He also said, teach them everything I have taught you. The idea of thy kingdom come. We should be striving as Christians to bring all of Christ's teachings into all areas of society. And I just get the feeling we're just really not doing that. And kind of part of why we are where we are is our fault at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, Aaron, I'm going to ask you, having just said, optimism and pessimism may not be biblical categories, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And here you are as someone who's lost their job as a result of the onslaught of anti-Christian activity, including in a Christian college. And there's talk in the conference about the Benedict option, Rod Dreher, and having to form separate communities or arcs to protect ourselves from this kind of thing. What's your view as you think about this and analyze where culture is on how we can respond to this as Christians?
Yeah, good question. And I think so. I was when I still had a job, I used to set Rod Dreher's text, the Benedict option. When it first came out in 2017, I think it was 2016-17. I set it as a text for the MA students for the mission course that I was running, saying this is the kind of stuff you actually need to be looking at postgrad level to be engaging with. And it shocked a few people because they were like, we're not allowed to talk about someone who says the phrase LGBT agenda. This is postgraduate academic level. And I was like, yes, indeed. It's postgraduate academic level. You're supposed to critically engage. You don't just go, well, it's anti-LGBT. It can't be the kind of thing we're allowed to talk about. So no, it is precisely what we need to talk about, and you need to articulate an argument.
You had to save that for the MA students. You have to save that for the MA students.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. So, and exactly, indeed, yeah. And so one of the things that I found that when we were going through that book was I love the diagnosis, and actually a lot of the Benedict option stuff, which is really the main symptoms. Really, like it's going to get worse. The Dark Ages equivalent are upon us. Barbarians at the gates, already inside the institutions, which is wokeness, absolutely woke barbarians. And actually, and this is before 2020, he's writing this, so that was a bit of an apocalyptic moment for many to see, things have really gone in another direction now. I think that slide is going to get worse. So whether we say that, I don't think it's pessimistic, just to say, if you have your eyes open, just looking realistically, it is going to get worse for Christians. And Rod Dreher is helpful. He's seen that and gone, we need to think about forming strong communities of people who actually believe the stuff. Not who just pay lip service to the stuff or who have a social cachet in paying lip service to the stuff. You're going to have to really believe it. And so the thing I've been speaking about is being shamelessly biblical in our theology. So we're not apologetic about it. We're really confident that this is good. As Tony was saying, this is good. God is good. End of story. And so I think because we're going to keep saying God is good, end of story, it's going to be worse. We're going to get backlash for us. I obviously face backlash even in an evangelical college. The one thing I would probably have critiqued Rod Dreher on, in that book at least, was he didn't seem to articulate Christian hope as strongly as I'd want him to. And it was almost as though, unless we do the arc right, unless we get into our bunkers and make our Benedictine monastery equivalents and hunker down and preserve culture, everything's going to fall apart. And you think, well, obviously, no, theologically, we're in God's hands. It doesn't mean we stop and go, well, we're in God's hands, so we don't have to do anything. We respond to God's word confidently and faithfully. And that means, yes, show communities of love, loving others, being peaceful, being gentle where we can, but also combating where we need to combat and exposing sin. We need to do all of those things, but we just remember that we're in God's hands, and the grace of God needs to come in that. And we're not actually worried by the future of the church is not in jeopardy, because the future of the church is in God's hands, not in our hands. But we need to. We're kind of fighting for those around us as well. We're saying, look, there's darkness. We want to show you the light, and you're going to hate us and say that we're the darkness. Because that's what happens when you are the darkness. You think that the light is the darkness and all the bad guys. We're going to be called that. We're going to be called names. We're going to have stuff thrown at us, as many Christians have had over 2,000 years, as they were building Christendom, as Christendom was emerging. And eventually the tide turned, and suddenly everyone was like, oh, now the done thing is to be Christian. Okay. And then eventually that changes again. So we don't quite know what the roller coaster of history is going to look like, but we can be absolutely confident that our God has previous of bringing his people out of Egypt, out of Babylon, sometimes into Babylon, actually, and saying there's different times and there's different requirements. So we have to realize what's happening and not necessarily be too surprised that these things are happening. But having said that, I'm very glad of institutions like Christian Concern, who aren't clearly, you're not trying to say let's bring it all back to where it was, but it's like, let's fight and stand up for these things. Let's expose sin and let's bring light, even though we're not necessarily going to assume that everything's going to turn around automatically. We need to show the world and show other Christians what time it is, basically.
Fantastic. Yeah, that was great. I'm conscious we sort of run out of time. We could have talked all day, I think, about this kind of stuff, and some of the stuff came out of the conference. A lot to talk about there. Maybe we'll do another discussion at another time or something. It was very, very good. Listen, thank you so much for joining us, all three of you, and particularly our special guests, Dr. Aaron Edwards and Dr. Tony Rucinski. Really good to have you, and it's great to connect with you at the conference again as well. There, and thank you for watching. Those of you watching and listening, hope you found that as enjoyable as I did. Do follow, connect, watch, and connect with us on social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and get our emails as well. And look forward to having another interesting conversation next week. Thank you very much.